Once overrun with witches and occultists, Lancashire was the centre of one of England's most terrifying supernatural events. The devil would weasel their way into a wealthy household and possess not one, not two, but 7 people. They shrieked, they convulsed, and their bellies swelled. Desperate for help, they turned to doctors, cunning folk, clerics, and the church. But no matter what they tried, the devil would not leave. This is a case that has it all. Demons, witches, disgraced ministers, illegal magic, you name it. This is the true story of the Lancashire 7. Our story takes us to the estate of Cleworth Hall in the historic county of Lancashire. Now, this was a sizable estate, spanning 163 acres, and the crown jewel was a magnificent timber-built hall. It had gables, bay windows, and of course, no fancy abode was complete without a moat to show off just how wealthy you were. It was all gifted to the very lucky Anne Parr by her father on her wedding day. She'd married Nicholas Starkey in 1578, who was also from another ridiculously rich family. The two settled in nicely to their new life together, and soon started to try for a baby. Sadly, they would experience tragedy after tragedy. Their first 4 children were all stillborn. Rumours started to swell that the Starkeys had been cursed. Some thought it was because Anne was a Catholic in a very Protestant England. Others believed that Anne's jealous relatives were to blame. You see, they felt cheated out of the Cleworth estate. The fact that it had been given to Anne, a woman, was completely unacceptable. So of course, they did what any reasonable person would do in this situation. They placed a curse on her. Witchcraft and occultism were rife in Lancashire. Some even went as far as to say that it was the most witch-ridden county in all of England.
Ooh, sounds like my kind of place.
I'm not finished yet. The area was poor, sparsely populated and agriculturally barren. What's more, religious tensions were high, because as well as being the most witchful county, it was also probably the most Catholic county in an England that was becoming more and more Protestant. The government's attempts to stamp out Catholicism here had really failed quite badly.
You're really selling it to me. I love a bit of rebellion.
With secret societies, occult Catholics, and churches lying in ruin, the devil had found a perfect home in Lancashire. And so has Gargi, it would seem. In 1584, it was finally looking like the curse had been lifted from the Starkey family. Their son John would be born, followed a year later by their daughter Anne. Over the next 10 years, the household really grew and flourished. But in 1594, things took a terrible turn when their children began to suffer from a strange and unusual illness. It started with their daughter Anne, who was suddenly stricken with a depressed, heavy countenance and a fearful starting and pulling together of her body. It was a little bit odd, but nothing too concerning. Her parents thought that maybe she'd caught a cold or a chill. A week later, though, their son John started acting strangely too. Usually well behaved, he found himself having these outbursts where he just couldn't stop himself from screaming and shouting. The strange behaviour continued, and it wasn't long before both children began to suffer from violent convulsions. Something was terribly wrong. Nicholas took the children to see doctor after doctor, and of course no expense was spared. In total, he ended up spending around £200 on medical treatments for them, but nothing seemed to help. It had been over 2 months, and the children were still suffering terribly. Their bodies were swollen, and they started to turn their faces towards their backs. At times, it looked like their faces were disfigured. They thrust out their tongues, and their mouths distorted into the most unsettling, unnatural smiles. Anne asked her husband to go to a Catholic priest for help. Maybe the illness wasn't a medical one, but something more sinister, something demonic. They eventually found a priest who agreed to help, but sadly, any hopes of a spiritual cure were soon dashed. With the government trying to suppress Catholicism, the priest was unable to smuggle their Book of Rites into England. Nicholas was at a loss. What else could he do to help his children? Thankfully, word soon got round to him about a cunning man called Edmund Hartley, who, as luck would have it, was skilled in the art of healing. Now, to the general public, cunning folk were seen as being different from witches. They used magic for good, and it was thought that their powers came from God, not from pacts with the devil. They prayed for good things, like for the sick to be healed, for good weather, and for fruitful harvests. They helped their clients with charms, magic rituals, prayer, and herbal medicines. Nicholas, at the end of his tether, turned to Edmund for help, offering him large sums of money in return for his services. It was an offer that Edmund certainly couldn't refuse, and he set to work on trying to heal the children. He's said to have treated the children with popish charms and herbs.
Herbs and charms, eh? Sounds like a fraud if you ask me.
Well, you know what? The treatment actually worked. Their fits eventually stopped, and for the better part of a year and a half, the children were well. They had the odd relapse, but it was nothing that Edmund couldn't fix with his remedies. The Starkey family were becoming more and more dependent on Edmund, and he had a devious plan to make sure that they were completely wrapped around his little finger. He pretended that he was going to leave the country, but each time he was on his way, their son John would have terrible nosebleeds. The bleeding just wouldn't stop. Nicholas, terrified for his son's life, would send for Edmund, who would dutifully rush back and, using his cunning folk ways, was able to stop the flow of blood. Edmund declared that only he had the power to help John. If he hadn't been able to make it back in time, no one else could have stopped the bleeding. By now, Edmund truly had the Starkey family in the palm of his hand, and he started to make some rather cheeky demands. Nicholas was already paying him a wonderful sum of £2 a year, but this wasn't enough. Nicholas offered him bed and board, but this still wasn't enough. He wanted his own house and grounds, a request which Nicholas unsurprisingly refused. Edmund was absolutely livid at this refusal, and he threatened to make such a shout at Cleworth as never was heard. Nicholas wasn't budging though, so Edmund had to make do with the offer of bed and board, moving in with them that summer. Unfortunately for the Starkey household, Edmund was a complete and utter nightmare to live with. He had a short temper and would turn out to be quite a lecherous man. He was continuously making passes at all of the women, trying to kiss them as they walked past him in the hallway or on the stairs. Nicholas wasn't enjoying Edmund's presence either. There was a constant power struggle between them, Edmund trying to assert his dominance at every opportunity. It was also becoming clear that something wasn't quite right with Edmund either. He seemed to be tormented by demons of his own. He too suffered from terrible fits, and the maidservants would often have to attend to him. Then, one evening, Jane Ashton, who was a 30-year-old maidservant, would sneak into Edmund's room. She began to rifle through his belongings. While she was doing this, she felt a sharp pain in her throat, like someone had stabbed her with a needle. She fled from Edmund's room, and to her horror, she started to cough up blood. She would cough up blood for a whole 2 days. As time went on, everyone's patience with Edmund began to wear thin. The children's fits had returned though, and the fact of the matter was, Edmund was the only one who could help them. It wasn't long though, before Edmund would take things too far. He would use forbidden magic. Nicholas had taken a trip to see his father, bringing Edmund along with him. The two would stay the night there. That night, Edmund tossed and turned, unable to sleep. It seemed as though he was being tormented by strange and unseen forces all night long. The next morning, he told Nicholas that he needed his help with something. The two men then made their way out to the woods nearby, Nicholas still in the dark as to Edmund's plans. Edmund searched for a suitable spot and then began to draw a circle on the ground. The circle was over 1 metre wide, and he divided it into 4 parts, making a cross at every division. Nicholas watched in horror. He'd heard about this kind of magic before, and it wasn't good. This was malevolent magic, magic to summon spirits. Once Edmund had finished drawing the elaborate circle on the ground, he asked Nicholas to tread it out. Nicholas hesitated. This was wrong, and certainly not something he should be a part of. But if it would help his children, maybe it was worth it. He reluctantly made his way around the circle, and when the ritual was complete, he heard Edmund say, "Now I shall trouble him that troubled me, and be meet with him that sought my death." Nicholas started to think that maybe the ritual hadn't been to help his children after all. You see, Edmund often spoke of having many enemies. He remembered how Edmund was tormented in the night. Perhaps he was being attacked by an enemy magic user, and this spell was to get back at them. At this point, the children's fits had been steadily worsening, and the ritual in the woods certainly hadn't helped them. Nicholas was disgusted with Edmund for using such dark magic. Magic that was illegal. So illegal that its use was potentially a capital offence. It was definitely time to try and find someone else to help his children. So, behind Edmund's back, he consulted with some doctors in Manchester. But unfortunately, none were able to help. Nicholas wasn't going to give up hope just yet, though. You see, he'd remembered that in Manchester, there was a legendary cleric called John Dee, one of the wisest men in the land, who had once been Queen Elizabeth's astronomer. If anyone could find a cure, it would certainly be him. So he went and pleaded his case to John Dee, telling John all about his children's affliction, about Edmund the Cunning Man, and how he'd drawn a summoning circle in the woods. John Dee listened carefully, but ultimately he refused to help. You see, he had to be careful. I mean, he liked to dabble in the occult, but this had gotten him into a lot of trouble earlier in his career. He was branded a conjurer and prosecuted for it. The Starkey case had the occult and demonic possession written all over it, and he wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. He told Nicholas to seek the help and assistance of some godly preachers. Although he wouldn't help Nicholas directly, he did take it upon himself to demand that Edmund come and see him. When Edmund arrived, John Dee gave him the telling off of a lifetime for conducting that summoning ritual in the woods. A little bit hypocritical, if you ask me, seeing that John Dee was known for summoning spirits himself. In fact, many scholars did it. They hoped that these spirits would help them gain otherworldly knowledge.
They'd be lucky. I've been summoned a few times in my day, and you humans will believe any old nonsense.
Really? Like what?
The demons live inside Brussels sprouts. That little gem came from me.
Of course it did. Interestingly, after John Dee had told Edmund off, the children's fits stopped for a few weeks, just in time for the festive period. Around New Year's Day, Nicholas sent the children to visit a relative in Manchester, along with Edmund, who would look after them. Whilst they were there, the children really wanted to go and see John Dee. They asked Edmund if he would take them, but he flat out refused and forbade them from going to see him. Likely because Edmund was still quite upset about that telling off. The children decided to go and see John Dee anyway, and when Edmund found out about this, he was absolutely furious. He flew into a rage and told them that it had been better for them not to have changed an old friend for a new. He was so angry that he refused to be anywhere near them for the whole journey home. A few days after they returned, Little John Starkey sat down to read, and as he did, he felt something strike the back of his neck. The pain from the blow was excruciating, and he cried out that Satan had broken his neck. He was in such agony that he was bedridden for a whole 2 hours. Later that same evening, he leapt out of bed with a terrible cry. It was so loud that the whole household rushed to his side to see what was wrong. It was like a wild animal had taken over his body. He thrashed about, snatching at, biting and hitting anyone that came near him, even his own mother. He took the bedstays out of the bed and hurled them at the heads of those in the room before throwing the pillows into the fire. These violent fits continued every single day for the next 2 months, and his sister began to suffer from violent fits too. Soon, the demonic infestation would spread to 3 young girls who had come to live with the Starkeys: Margaret, Eleanor, and Ellen. All 5 of the children began to bark and howl like dogs, baying in unison for 15 minutes at a time. They then collapsed to the floor, speechless, senseless. It was as if they were dead. They were struck blind, deaf and dumb for days at a time. Each was plagued by at least 2 spirits, one to torment them inwardly with all the torments of hell, and the other to stand before their faces, most ugly and terrible. Edmund was also suffering greatly during this period too, having his own awful fits. One night, Margaret Byram, a 33-year-old relative who had come to stay with the Starkeys, heard strange noises coming from Edmund's room. She and some others rushed in, fearing that he was suffering from another one of his fits. She sat down by his bedside and began to talk to him. After a while, he sat up and he leaned towards her. As he did this, something very strange happened. Margaret tried to stand up, but she couldn't. She tried to speak, but no words would come out. She was so benumbed and giddy. Some of the maidservants tried to help her get back on her feet. She sank down and became senseless. Edmund was heard to say, "I fear I have done her harm," before leaving the room. Once Margaret had recovered, he returned to her side to comfort her. This bizarre event got everyone in the Starkey household talking. Word spread that Edmund had bewitched Margaret by breathing the devil into her. Edmund's fits would now stop, but Margaret's would only grow worse. It was the 10th of January and Margaret Byron sat warming herself by the kitchen fire. She was still shaken from her ordeal with Edmund, and for some reason she just couldn't get the man out of her mind. The warm fire helped her to relax a bit, but it would turn out that now certainly wasn't the time for her to let her guard down. She was suddenly attacked by an unseen force that violently threw her about the room, flinging her towards the kitchen fire, as if it wanted her to burn. The fit continued for quite some time, and just when she thought she was recovered, the force threw her under a table. It felt as if something was rolling around in her belly. A creature. A calf, she thought.
Hang on, baby cows are huge. How would it even fit?
You're thinking about this far too logically. It was a supernatural calf, you see, so it all makes sense. The creature would rise up from her belly towards her heart, and if that wasn't bad enough, it felt as though its head and nose were full of nails. As it rose up, the nails stabbed her and she shrieked in agony. Her belly swelled as if she was pregnant, and the calf writhed around, up and down, tossing Margaret about as it did. She then breathed out a stream of cold, icy air, and as she did, her swollen belly returned to normal, and she started to bark and howl like a dog. Next, Jane Ashton, that 30-year-old maidservant from earlier, would also join the ranks of the possessed, making terrible, inhuman noises. Rumour had it that she'd been romantically involved with Edmund, and his evil kiss was to blame. As the end of January neared, Margaret Byron, still suffering from violent fits, went to go and visit her mother in Salford, near Manchester. Interestingly, she had Edmund go with her. Some suggest that they were now also in a relationship together. When they arrived at Margaret's family home, her fits continued. Edmund did his best to help, but nothing worked. Sometimes she couldn't eat or drink, and at other times she would gorge herself, slossing up her meat like a greedy dog or hog, a sight that her family found shameful and disgusting. During one of her fits, out of her mouth came such a stinking smoke and breath. The smell was so bad that no one could come near her. When the terrible stench finally dissipated, many people gathered round her to pray for her. Among these was John Dee's curate called Matthew Palmer. He watched Edmund praying for Margaret, and he thought that his prayers sounded a little bit odd. It was all very suspicious. He decided that he would test Edmund by asking him to say the Lord's Prayer. Unfortunately, this was a prayer that Edmund didn't know. He tried to fumble his way through it, and his attempts were really quite pitiful. Now, not being able to recite the Lord's Prayer is actually quite a big deal. It could be evidence that you were a witch in league with the devil. So Edmund, as you can imagine, was in some really big trouble. He'd failed to say the Lord's Prayer in front of many witnesses. Because of this, he was brought before 2 justices of the peace and then taken into custody on suspicions of being a witch. Legal proceedings against him would soon begin, and the 7 possessed would be called upon as witnesses. First on the list for questioning was Margaret Byron. With this news, she found herself tormented by the devil for 2 nights in a row. The devil took on the shape of Edmund and asked her to be careful what she said to the justices, promising her riches in return. When the justices finally arrived to question her, she found that she couldn't get the words out. No matter how hard she tried, she just couldn't say anything bad about Edmund. She suffered terrible convulsions, her belly swelled, and she was haunted by visions of a great black dog with a monstrous tail. The 5 children were then questioned, but they too suffered fits, falling to the floor and claiming that Edmund had stopped their mouths and would not suffer them to speak. Jane Ashton also couldn't speak against Edmund. Instead, she could only bark and howl when questioned. At the end of the investigation, the justices were pretty sure that Edmund had bewitched the 7 possessed. He'd done it by placing a kiss on each of them, feeding the devil into their bodies. There was just one tiny little problem, though. No one had managed to provide any testimony against Edmund that was admissible in court, and Edmund was of course adamant that he was innocent. The most they could do at this point was to put Edmund in jail for a year. But this wasn't enough for the Starkey family. They wanted to see him hang. So it came time for Nicholas Starkey to give his testimony. He told the court all about the summoning ritual that Edmund had carried out in the woods. It was this illegal magic that sealed Edmund's fate, and he was sentenced to death. Edmund was taken to the gallows, and would you believe it? The first attempt to hang him failed. As he was dropped from the gallows, the rope snapped and he fell to the ground. Overjoyed, he thought that this was a sign from God that that he should confess his sins and that he would be forgiven.
What? No, he should have gone with, "It's a sign from God that I'm innocent."
I definitely agree. I think that would have been more likely to save him. Anyway, with arms outstretched to the heavens, he prayed to God and confessed to the summoning ritual. Sadly, this didn't gain him any sympathy. He wasn't to be spared, and he soon found himself strung up again. The second time, the rope did not snap, and Edmund's life was taken away. The Starkeys thought that this would be the end to their horrific ordeal, but it wasn't. The possessions continued on. The devil refused to leave Cleworth Hall. Eventually, 2 clergymen, John Darrell and George Moore, were brought in to help. As soon as they arrived, the demons were put on a terrifying display. The children were attacked by unseen forces, tumbling to the floor and being thrown around the room. Their faces were distorted and their bellies swollen with lumps underneath the skin. A strange rolling sound emanated from their bodies, and it seemed that each of them had a creature living inside of them. Next, Jane Ashton began to bark and howl, and they could see that her belly was swollen too. John and George gathered all the afflicted into one room, where they could examine them carefully. The demonic display continued. They gave themselves up to scoffing and blasphemy, calling the Holy Bible bibble babble, bibble babble. They made ungodly noises, screeching and whooping in unison. The supernatural noises were so loud that they reverberated throughout the entire house. It would seem that Edmund's threat had been fulfilled. There was indeed such a shout at Cleworth Hall as never was heard. John and George were getting nowhere. The screeching intensified, and they were forced to leave the room, feeling quite discouraged and lost. They realised that dispelling these demons was going to be much, much harder than they had originally thought. So they called upon a local pastor called John Dickens for help. Feeling more confident with their new ally, they made their way back into the room with the 7 possessed. They used words of exhortation to sanctify themselves and the Starkey family. As they spoke these words, the screeching and whooping stopped. Cleworth Hall felt calm, almost peaceful. This calm would be short-lived though, because tomorrow was the big day, the day the dispossession would begin. Early in the morning, the possessed 7 were led into the parlour and each given a couch to lie down on. In addition to the 3 clergymen, there would be about 30 witnesses to the dispossession. These witnesses would spend the day fasting, praying and reading scriptures. Whilst those around them prayed, the 7 possessed suffered fit after fit. They screamed and they cried. The noises that they made sounded inhuman. Jane Ashton writhed around in pain. Her heart felt like it was going to burst, and she started vomiting up phlegm and blood. Blood gushed out of little John Starkey's nose and mouth, and he started to grind his teeth together. Many of them vomited up something like phlegm and thick spittle. For hours on end, the 30 witnesses continued to pray, and the 3 clergymen took it in turns to deliver sermons. They all pushed on and on through their hunger and fatigue. The battle seemed never-ending, but soon they would have their first success. Just after 5 p.m, Margaret Byram, who had been lying lifeless for half an hour, suddenly sat up, most joyfully magnifying God. The prayers had worked. They compelled the demon to leave her body. She felt it move from her belly all the way up into her throat, and then out of her mouth, leaving behind an awful, filthy smell. It took on the form of a crow's head, and with a fiery flash, it flew out of the window.
Wait, did everyone see this?
Nope, only the possessed could see their demons. Next to be saved was little John Starkey. His demon left him in the form of a man with a hump on his back. Anne's demon departed in the form of a foul, ugly man with a white beard. By the end of the day, all of the demons had been expelled. Or so they thought. In the early hours of the morning, Jane Ashton could be heard screaming at the top of her lungs. The 3 ministers rushed into her room, ready to do battle with the demon again. She confessed that yesterday she'd actually given in to the demon. She pretended that it had left her body when it hadn't. You see, the demon had promised her relief if she'd concealed its presence. But of course, this promise was a lie. She was brought into the parlour once again, and this time 50 witnesses would gather to help. For many hours they joined in prayer for her. Finally, the demon was expelled from her body. It was ugly like a toad. Over the next few days, the sneaky demons tried their best to tempt the seven, trying very, very hard to repossess them. The ministers urged them to resist by faith and prayer. The seven put up a really good fight, and the demons finally disappeared, never to return again. Little John Starkey went on to live a happy, fulfilling life. He'd eventually become a colonel in England's Civil War, and also served as a justice of the peace. He would live to the grand old age of 80, which is pretty good going if you ask me. Sadly, not much is known about the rest of the Lancashire Seven, but I hope that they too lived happy lives. As for the ministers, John Darrell and George Moore, well, they would get themselves into quite a bit of trouble. They were involved in the dispossession of a man called William Somers, who would eventually confess that he'd faked his possession, and that John Darrell and George Moore were in on it. So, in 1599, a commission of the Archbishop of Canterbury found both ministers guilty of fraud, and they were thrown into prison. So, what really happened here? Well, at the time, there was a lot of religious, spiritual and political tension in Lancashire. Fear of witchcraft was at an all-time high. The Earl of Derby had passed away, and rumour had it that he'd been bewitched. It's possible that, to start with, little John and Anne Starkey were suffering from a conversion disorder where stress and anxiety are converted into physical symptoms. Now, Edmund probably did have a part to play, not in the form of witchcraft, but because he brought a lot of stress into the Starkey household, with his power struggles, his short temper, and his lecherous ways. Interestingly, the only two adults to be possessed were women who supposedly had romantic relations with him. We must also think about who wrote the main accounts on this and why. They were written by George Moore and John Darrell. George Moore's account in particular was written to clear their names, to prove that they weren't frauds, and to paint them as the heroes that saved the day. Now, demonic possession has often been likened to a play. The symptoms are well documented, and once someone believes that they've been possessed, they seem to unconsciously or consciously follow the script set out by the beliefs commonly held at the time. In a closely knit household with shared anxieties, the idea of being possessed could easily spread. Then again, maybe there really was something supernatural going on. In the words of Anton Chekhov, nothing is clear in this world. Only fools and charlatans know and understand everything. If you got something from this video, Gargi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, don't try and conjure spirits, it might just be your undoing. And I hope you have a magnificent day.